Welcome to POTUS 2017, where we keep watch on the Oval Office and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. On Monday, the country will honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with the annual national holiday. Just 4 days later, Donald J. Trump will be inaugurated, and America's first black president will be history. Barack Obama said goodbye to the nation this week, with hopeful reminders of what his administration accomplished and with a warning that a house divided against itself by inequality and race cannot stand. He explicitly addressed both whites and people of color.
For blacks and other minority groups, that means tying our own very real struggles for justice to the challenges that a lot of people in this country face. Not only the refugee or the immigrant or the rural poor or the transgender American, but also the middle-aged white guy who, from the outside, may seem like he's got advantages, but has seen his world upended by economic and cultural and technological change. We have to pay attention and listen. For white Americans, it means acknowledging that the effects of slavery and Jim Crow didn't suddenly vanish in the 60s. That when minority groups voice discontent, they're not just engaging in reverse racism or practicing political correctness. When they wage peaceful protest, they're not demanding special treatment, but the equal treatment that our founders promised.
President Obama from his farewell address. So how fragile is America's democracy? How much might the Trump administration foster disunity and slow the continuing fight for equal rights? At the confirmation hearing of Senator Jeff Sessions for Attorney General, many expressed great concerns because of his past statements on race, religion, sexuality, torture, and immigration. Sessions argued that his opponents paint a caricature of him, taking his words out of context. But Democratic Senator Al Franken of Minnesota grilled Sessions on his own claim in a previous interview of filing many more civil rights cases when he was U.S. Attorney in Alabama than he actually did.
Now, in that same interview, you said, quote, "I filed 20 or 30 civil rights cases to desegregate schools and political organizations and county commissions when I was United States Attorney." So 20 or 30 desegregation cases. Did I misread that quote?
I believe that's what I've been quoted as saying, and I suspect I said that.
Okay, now that was 2009, but in November of this year, your office said, quote, "When Senator Sessions was U.S. Attorney, he filed a number of desegregation lawsuits in Alabama, not 20 or 30 this time, but a number." So tell me, did you file 20 or 30 desegregation cases, or is it some other number?
Well, thank you, Senator Franken. It is important for us to be accurate. The records don't show that there were 20 or 30 actually filed cases. Some of the cases involve multiple defendants and multiple parties, like a school board and a county commission being sued for racial discrimination, things of that nature. But the number would be less than that, as we've looked at. So
what do you think would have caused you to say
I don't know.
that you filed 20 or 30 desegregation?
Well, we had cases going throughout my district, and some of them were started before I came and continued after I left. Some of them were brought and then settled promptly. And so it was extraordinarily difficult, actually, and I was surprised to get a record by checking the docket sheets to find out exactly how many cases were involved.
Senator Al Franken versus Jefferson Sessions, Donald Trump's pick for Attorney General. At this pivotal point in American history, 51 years after Dr. King led the Voting Rights March in Selma, how different is America after 8 years of our first black president? And how important is Justice Department policy for the future of our democracy? Joining us, Janai Nelson, Associate Director Counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
We'll talk about that Sessions clip in a minute.
I hope so.
First, on President Obama's legacy, how much do you think he brought about real change and progress in terms of racial justice and equal rights, and how much was it more symbolic and rhetorical?
Well, it's interesting. I think he did an enormous amount for our country, and it's actually quite difficult to measure it. If we recall where we started in 2008, we started at the brink of absolute economic disaster. I'm not even sure if it was at the brink. We were actually tipping over the precipice. And you never know how bad it could have gotten, and what he was able to prevent in his economic policies and, you know, many of the controversial supports of some of our financial institutions ultimately saved our country from plummeting into an economic abyss. But you can't see that, so it's nothing that you can really point to as a victory, but I think we should acknowledge where we were headed and how he diverted our course. And of course, we saw incredible developments on a number of social issues. You know, the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which he led with right out the box, embracing
allowing people who are filing discrimination in employment suits to do it based on when their last discriminated against paycheck was filed rather than when they were hired, basically, right?
That's right, that's right. Because there's so little transparency in salaries, so many women and others don't recognize when they're being paid at a salary that's less than someone else. And once they discover that last discriminatory act, it's incredibly important to allow that to still be redressed in courts. And he saw that. And he saw that not only because it would send a message to employers that this is a type of practice that should not be countenanced, but it also empowered women to recognize that pay equity is something that we should still pursue, that we should advocate for, and that there is an appetite for in this country.
You know, he got it from the left and the right. He got it from the right for, they would cite things like jumping out ahead publicly of the evidence in cases like Trayvon Martin or Ferguson, when eventually the accused were exonerated by juries or grand juries. From black intellectuals, he often gets it for not being explicitly racial enough in his policies and his language. Where do you come down?
Well, I'm not surprised. So many people placed enormous hopes on him and his presidency that it was impossible for him to fulfill them. And in certain places, he probably did fall short. I think we can point to the number of deportations and some areas around immigration that are quite concerning. But given the hand he was dealt, and recognizing that in his 8 years, only 6 of them did he have a Congress with whom he could work.
Only 2 of them.
I mean,
The
quite the opposite.
2.
That's right. The 6 out of the 8, he could not really work with Congress toward any progressive legislation. Only 2 of them did he have Congress in his favor.
And those were, of course, the years in which Obamacare passed.
That's right.
And I've heard a few people frame Obamacare as, on one level, the greatest piece of civil rights legislation since the 1960s, because so many of the uninsured disproportionately have been people of color, and so it had that effect, even if it wasn't that, entitled. Do you see it that way?
I certainly do, because when we look at a number of civil rights issues, when we look at education inequality, when we look at access to jobs, when we look at so many things that ail communities of color, there's also at the root issues of health and issues of just general well-being. And having Obamacare certainly lifted those communities and allowed them access to health care in a way that they had not received before. And all of that is tied. It's all part of a greater whole. You can't expect people to perform well if they aren't getting the appropriate health care. So it was certainly a boon for people of color and others in this country.
What did you think of the farewell address section on race that we played? He, as he does, was meticulous in trying to kind of give it to one racial group and give it to another racial group by name, but kind of saying, hey, everybody's responsible for making this better, not just the people who've been discriminated against for 500 years.
Yes, he's...
not just the people who've been discriminating for 500 years.
That's right. He's He's the consummate balancer of ails and complaints. And he has sometimes not done the best job at that. I think last night was a good example of him not pulling back on the vestiges of some of the darkest moments of our country and how they continue to impact contemporary American life. You know, his comment about African Americans and other people of color needing to find some sort of interest convergence with everyone else in the country, I think is a point well taken. It would have been helpful to acknowledge, though, that there still is white privilege that makes that equation not quite equitable in the way that he framed it.
And the way that he wanted to bring in white privilege, as we saw in the clip, was, hey, not every white guy has white privilege. A lot of them don't experience their lives as being privileged as they struggle with economic change and automation and things like that.
Certainly, they may not see it that way, but I think it's important to recognize that overall there is a white privilege that most white Americans, if not all, enjoy, whether or not they are aware of it or really contemplate it as part of their daily life.
So on this week of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, here comes a new president who only got 8% of the black vote. What are your biggest concerns?
Where do I begin? There are so many, and there is no hope that this president-elect, who, as you said, was certainly not the favored candidate of the African American community by a long shot, nor the favored candidate of most Americans, and it's important for us to remember that he's done nothing since being elected. And recognizing the angst that his election has produced domestically and internationally, he's done nothing to suggest that he's going to try to repair the harm that very divisive and abusive in many ways campaign created here in this country. So I'm very concerned. I'm concerned about the Department of Justice, and I'm concerned about whether civil rights will continue to be protected in the way that they have under the Obama administration and even previous administrations. I'm concerned about the well-being of our democracy as a whole, because there seems to be so little respect for the rule of law and a particular disdain for the protection of voting rights.
Jeff Sessions, in his confirmation hearings, did seem to try to go many lengths toward reassuring people that he would be an attorney general who cares about civil rights. Even in that clip we saw, if he was being called out by Franken for exaggerating the number of civil rights cases he brought when he was U.S. Attorney for Alabama, it at least suggests that he feels he has an interest in emphasizing, even if exaggerating, his legacy so far as a defender of civil rights.
You're right, Brian, but there's such a difference between optics and action. And what he's doing in his hearing is all about the optics. And what he did leading up to his hearing and suggesting that he's been a civil rights supporter and a litigator and he's really an activist at heart is so completely untrue and is belied by his actual record. His action against so many pieces of legislation that would advance civil rights in this country, the Violence Against Women Act, the Hate Crimes Act, his work around sentencing, even though he supported a change in certain sentencing disparities, he was an outlier in how aggressively he wanted to hold on to a significant disparity in sentencing. And that's all current. I can go back to the sordid history that led to his defeat in 1986 when he was first nominated to be a federal judge. And there are clear claims and proven evidence of how he abused his power as a prosecutor that gives us significant pause.
It's one thing to be a senator who's opposed to progressive racial policies and has a vote. It's another thing to be an attorney general whose job is to uphold existing law. So is it possible that his biggest failures might be in things he doesn't do, cases not brought, local police departments not overseen, things like that?
Sure. We're very concerned about a Department of Justice that would basically lie dormant in the protection and even advancement of civil rights protections and the enforcement of those laws, which allows the doctrine to develop and to really evolve over time and to respond to society and new societal needs. But it's not just that. It's also the concern that he can use the power of the Department of Justice to, in fact, go after civil rights and to interrogate and harass individuals who seek to continue to uphold these values.
What's an example of that? What's a hypothetical situation where you'd be afraid that he would actually use the power of the Attorney General to go after civil rights activists?
Sure. So I don't want to paint a roadmap. I can certainly point to what he's already done, and that is the heinous prosecution of the Marion Three elderly black activists in Alabama who worked with a very uneducated and poor African American community to help them register to vote and to assist them at the polls.
This is back in the 1980s.
This is back in the 1980s. And what he did is he used his prosecutorial authority there, not only to bring charges when there was not ample evidence to support such an aggressive prosecution, but the way in which he did it, he made those individuals travel almost 170 miles to testify. He continued to barrage them with demands, and even in the face of evidence that this case was not going anywhere, he continued to prosecute it. They were ultimately acquitted after 4 hours of jury deliberation, but the pain and suffering that those three individuals, and more importantly, the larger community of African Americans in Alabama suffered, and the chilling effect that that had, shows you how powerful and dangerous that sort of authority in the hands of someone like Jeff Sessions is.
Janai Nelson from the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Let's hope it's not too active 4 years in terms of having to play defense on civil rights. We will see what happens. Of course, we don't know as we sit here whether Jeff Sessions will be confirmed. That's the point that we're at right now. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Time for some additional evidence. Time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. Our evidence for Martin Luther King Week comes from the intersection of social justice and entrepreneurship. Majora Carter is founder of the consulting firm Majora Carter Group and the social entrepreneurial tech company Startup Box, which operates out of the South Bronx, New York City. Carter won a MacArthur Fellowship for her work, and appropriate for this moment, the Martin Luther King Award for community service, among many awards that she's won. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
I see your title is, or what you like to go by, is Urban Revitalization Strategist.
Yes.
What does that mean?
It essentially means that I use the tools that I've learned through very hard work over the past almost nearly 20 years around how low status communities develop or don't develop. And is it either we're taking the sort of standard approach through gentrification or typical gentrification, or are we just looking at sort of poverty level economic maintenance? And I realized that you can use real estate development and other types of school tools, in particular local economic development, as ways to support and retain talent in those communities and reduce brain drain and actually create more of a living local economy.
So would it be accurate to call you a real estate developer?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Give people an example of the kind of thing that you developed that fits this model.
Sure. So it's essentially, what we did was we studied different trends of what's going on nationally and also regionally, and then looked at whether or not in low status communities in particular, what was going on there. You know, what are the economic trends, and how were those communities being excluded from it? And were we essentially setting up the kinds of developments that encourage people that were born and raised in those communities to either look at value in them, or were they selling early and cheap? And we realized that the kind of people that were generally the strivers in any community in those neighborhoods were the ones that were leaving those own communities, seeing no value in theirs. And what we started doing was creating literal economic developments, such as cafes. We're working on, we're acquiring property to do things like restaurant incubators that specifically speak to the lifestyle that people who grow up in challenged communities, are taught to expect when they grow up and out of them. So we're building those in those communities and trying to encourage people to stay and invest in their own neighborhoods by being the first out the box to create those kind of things.
It's how, I don't know if ghetto is, such a cliche term, people shouldn't use it anymore, but in a sense you're trying to not ghettoize the poorest inner city urban areas by having the people who are the most successful who come out of them see a point in continuing to live there.
Yes, what we're doing is really trying to address some of the unintended consequences of the civil rights movement, which was often that, we were racially segregated a lot of the time, but our communities were economically diverse. And there was lots of beauty and social cohesion in that. But when people could leave because the law said, oh, now you can move, even though we know that was wrought with all sorts of things, they did. But what did that mean for the people that were left behind? Those types of communities, we're still struggling in those communities. We've never really dealt with that. And in neighborhoods where we're taught to measure success by how far we get away from them, those are the places where you've got the worst health outcomes, educational outcomes, just people higher incarceration rates, all those things. And what we're trying to do is not just say, let's wait until it's safe for white people to move back into those neighborhoods through reurbanization and gentrify them in the typical way. We're saying, how about we self-gentrify our own communities and create the kind of places that's with development that's by us and for us, and that ultimately supports us.
So is there a role for policy in supporting this kind of development? And to the point of the current moment, obviously we have a real estate developer about to become president. Is he aware of you, and is this something that he might get better than people whose sole backgrounds have been in government?
I'm not going to try to say if he's aware of me or not, but what I do think that any policymaker, president or otherwise, but especially on the local level, should do is think about more economic diversity and supporting that in any way in low status communities in particular. Because what I think that we deal with a lot of the times in those neighborhoods, whether they're inner city ghettos or even formerly booming white coal mining towns or whatever, what we're often dealing with is lower expectations of what those people need. And policymakers, I think, are just at a race to the bottom to make sure that we protect low status community and Americans in particular, and not necessarily give them the tools to actually thrive.
So have you had a meeting, or are you going to seek a meeting with the incoming Housing and Urban Development Secretary, Ben Carson?
I speak to everybody who will actually entertain a meeting with me, because I really do believe that we've been struggling in our communities for decades. Even since the passage of major civil rights legislation, black male unemployment has actually gone up most years, the larger majority of them. And and we like to think that or some folks will think that it's just, just now we're seeing a lot of police brutality and other issues around, just race and class in our country. It's just that the internet makes it easier to get.
So do you think that the civil rights community, in the traditional meaning of that term, has been too focused on what I think you called before, poverty maintenance?
Poverty level economic maintenance. I think that lots of people bear, some responsibility for it, and I think that progressives in particular would think more about the fact that there's been a lot of movement, or so we say, in terms of the actual legislation that goes out there, instead of looking actually, well, what's the reality on the ground? I mean, if you just look at a stat about black male unemployment going up since the passage of civil rights legislation, one would think that people would actually take that seriously and have been taking it seriously. But instead, what we see more of is just like, let's build more affordable housing in that community, and not let's actually look at what economic trends are in that region,
so what would
and train
it be?
toward that.
A lot of people who have hope in Donald Trump, who find hope in Donald Trump, find it because they hope he's going to create jobs.
Well, yeah, I think that is what we were unable to do, especially in many low status communities of all colors, for the past even 8 years, is that, and whether or not it was a a Congress that wasn't able to help or whatever, or actively opposed to it, doesn't make any difference. People were still, many of those same people that voted for Trump actually also voted for Obama, but things did not happen. And I think ultimately it is about economic development. It is about everyone's ability to be able to take care of their family, feel as though they've got something to contribute, period.
Especially in certain mostly white working class counties in the Midwest, there were counties that Obama carried that Clinton failed to carry against Trump.
And that should, which you would think, say something, you know, to the Democrats, to progressives, and it's like, oh, what did we do wrong here? Maybe it wasn't just this election. Perhaps it's been a long, long history where, guess what? You've not been paying attention.
So what policy requests would you have if you do have the Trump administration's ear to help the kind of economic development you're talking about?
It's all about increasing economic diversity, you know, in particular striving toward that in low status community. So the kind of things that I would think about is like, you know, he's somebody who's been talking about infrastructure a lot. Let's create a real infrastructure program that's green and focused on green infrastructure, that's focused on regular traditional gray infrastructure, rebuilding our roads, getting people trained up and ready to do that kind of work. That kind of investment right now would be, that would go across the board. And again, he doesn't ever have to be nice to black people to get him to work. And people would be really happy about that. And then I think the other kind of piece is like, is there a way to kind of even look at jiggering the laws around philanthropy and around basically being able to shelter money based on what I think is amounted to, in a lot of ways, it's very patriarchal approaches to low status communities, and it's sort of like, we're here to take care of you. That's where a lot of the money goes to, and it's not incentivizing the kind of what are considered risky kind of projects, like frankly the one that I did, which was essentially urban onshoring, generally offshore tech jobs into the local community. People thought I was crazy. It's like, why would you do that? And because it's like, this is where we can get entry-level tech jobs, you know, in low status communities so that people can build career ladders out of it. It took us a couple years to even make that a reality. Or no, we spent 2 years of my own money mostly doing this with very little philanthropic help. But sooner or later, people like JP Morgan Chase Foundation figured that, oh, there actually is something to it. But initially, just too risky. Why would you think about it?
So it's about new models of public-private partnerships?
Yes, absolutely. And really looking at the social innovators in our country and taking them seriously instead of looking at, you know, what's more of like the more the patriarchal model of dealing with poor communities.
It sounds like you might be kind of optimistic about the particular change of administration we're about to experience.
You know, again, the kind of work that I do was hardly dependent on who was in the White House. As a matter of fact, some of my early work I got done under George W. Bush administration, and that was supposed to be impossible as well, but it wasn't.
Thank you very much for joining us on Martin Luther King Week.
Thanks very much.
And that's our program for today. We're here each week at this hour, keeping an eye on the Oval Office and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.